Did he know you were following him, or were you way back, or did he notice you?
Well, he just left, and I shuffled after him like I used to when I was a 2-year-old, trying to walk in my dad's Sunday slippers. I mean, I could not walk in shoes. They were like 14, size 14. They're huge. They were huge shoes. It wasn't even close to fitting a 10-year-old boy's feet. I mean, I grew into 10.5 triple E, so I had wide feet, but they were still fairly small. And I was not yet an adolescent, so my feet were still rather small. And I followed him straight south and then diagonally up the cemetery down to the eastern gate that's visible in some of the photographs of Gettysburg, the eastern gate of the Evergreen Cemetery, which was the civilian cemetery where they had placed all of the combat dead until they built a U.S. federal cemetery north of the civilian cemetery, north of Evergreen Cemetery. And they actually, I found out during my trip last year, they moved all of the combat dead except 8 bodies into the U.S. cemetery north of Evergreen Cemetery. So I can confirm that Lincoln spoke from the northern side of a dais that was constructed on the northern edge of the Evergreen Cemetery, speaking north with the new cemetery where the bodies would be laying after he left in front of him. So he was essentially consecrating a new U.S. Military cemetery that was literally being consecrated by his speech. That's why he used the phrase hallowed and so forth in the Gettysburg Address. He was consecrating the cemetery where they had not yet moved the combat dead from the Evergreen Cemetery. And I know that because when I was looking toward the dais, the distinctive arched, sort of marble arch shaped, if you think of Marble Arch in London, the kind of marble arch shaped gate on the eastern side of the Evergreen Cemetery was immediately to our left where they had constructed the dais, but somewhat south of that location as we were looking south at the north-facing dais, which was really just about a 100 by 30-foot platform with 3 feet of patriotic, red, white, and blue bunting around it, but nothing else. There were no posts, no proscenium arch, no lectern. It was just like a flatbed truck bed, about 300 square feet, maybe a little larger.
Was that gate there when you revisited 150 years later?
Yeah, the stone or concrete gate on the eastern side of Evergreen Cemetery, which, as I said, I saw to my left as I was fronting the dais, and I could take an historian to exactly where Lincoln was standing because I went to this location because even though the federal cemeteries were closed because of that economic crisis back in last fall, but the civilian cemeteries were open, and I went and I found literally the spot where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address because I could estimate where the center of the dais was. But anyway, yeah, that's still there. That's distinctively still there. And so I first went over to the left side of the dais, and there were 2 young women, I would say maybe 19, 20 years of age, dressed in their Sunday best, looking over at me and kind of gossiping about me behind their fans. So they were sort of using their fans not to cool themselves because it was still brisk, but to kind of disguise the fact that they were chit-chatting with each other and looking over at me. And if you think of the fact that I was dressed in an adult Union winter parka and grossly oversized shoes, I must have looked like a carpetbagger to them. I had a mix of, I had Union Bugle Boy pantaloon pants, an adult medium-sized winter parka, a makeshift hat, and then civilian street shoes on. So I looked basically like a clown or a harlequin. And I was actually embarrassed with how I had been outfitted in a humanitarian way, nonetheless, by the man who helped me. He was quite concerned. And that's also something I verified after I identified who that man was. But I then went to the front of the dais, hoping to escape the attention of the young women, because I had been told to always avoid scrutiny, always be as inconspicuous as possible, and by all means avoid arrest or capture. Because they were afraid that if I was put in some narrow jail cell, let's say, or some other close quarters, that they wouldn't be able to go in and snatch me and rescue me if something went wrong with the means of time travel that had sent me to some place. So there was always that possibility of an emergency rescue. And I was given an emergency rescue one time. Myself and one of the other children, we were trapped walking along a dry land area that was just utterly suffering from a drought, and we were lost and out of water and thirsty, and we were actually rescued by somebody in the project. But in any case, I go to the front of the dais, and I turn to my left, and I see my father dressed as a Pennsylvania farmer, looking about 4 years younger than he did back at the plasma confinement chamber in 1972, or, for example, how he looked at the house.
Uh-huh.
And he later described how I looked 4 years older, and that's how he learned I was going to be in the program. So here I am from real time in 1972. They send me back to 1863, and I see a 4 years younger version of my father, and he sees a 4 years older version of me. And so I address him, and I go, Dad, what are you doing here? I didn't know you were going to come here. I thought you and Dr. Colgate were just sending me. And he stepped back a couple of feet and totally improvising, but right in character, so as to avoid this threat to operational security, he said, I'm not your paw's son. Your paw's somewhere else, not here. So what he was doing was literally ad-libbing, because he realized that somehow I was implicated in the time place he'd been sent to. And when he could see that I was 4 years older, my dad was very bright, even though he was born in rural Pennsylvania to an impoverished Polish immigrant coal mining family. He was brilliant generally, especially in mathematics and physics. That's why he was one of the principals on Project Pegasus. So he quickly ad-libbed and declaimed the notion that I was his father. And that really spooked me, because here I am. I've been sent via the wormholing. I've endured the feverish sensation upon arrival, the smell of ozone, the trip into town in bare feet with my teeth chattering so bad I couldn't control them, then the confrontation with the man at the clothing store, him dressing me up in a silly way and then being noticed by some of the young townswomen, and now my own father is declaiming my status as his son in the past here, 109 years in the past.
Right.
So I then went back to the left side of the dais, and as I walked over there, by then already more people were gathering. We were there very early. My father must have been the first arrival, and he was standing right in the front center of the dais. And he later described for me how Lincoln sounded and looked during the speech. So I go to the third spot, again, trying to utilize my training to avoid being conspicuous. And I was standing there, and there were two Union officers. One, a very handsome, mustachioed officer leaning up against the dais. The other, a rather homely man who was cutting an apple with a paring knife and sliding the slice of apple into his mouth almost in one move. And he was a lesser officer. He was sort of like a major and a sergeant. And the sergeant, the one slicing the apple, stepped forward and got right into my face. So he was actually causing spittle to hit my face as he was chomping on a mouthful of apple slices. And he said, what's your regiment, boy? And I said, regiment, sir? And he goes, yeah, what regiment are you with? And I said, I don't know, sir. And he looked back at the senior officer and kind of quizzically and said, this Union bugle boy doesn't know what regiment he's with. And then he turned and sliced another chomp of apple and got some more spittle on my face and leaned right down in front of me, as a 10-year-old, and said, where's your regiment bivouac, boy? And I said, bivouac, sir? What's that?
Oh,
and then he then addressed the senior officer and said, this bugle boy doesn't know where he's bivouacked and doesn't even know what bivouac means. And then he kind of got down a little closer on my level. He kind of squatted a little bit and said, boy, have you seen a little bit too much of the fight, son? Are you touched in the head? And trying to get away from these two, because I realized they were Union officers and they would readily arrest me for being at the Lincoln speech site without an excuse to be there, maybe a threat to security of the president. I said, yes, sir, I'm touched in the head. And they laughed so hysterically that they practically fell over, which I think shows how by 1863, those who were in the battle were inured to the finer sensibilities in life, because they just thought it was hysterical that apparently I was a Union bugle boy who had heard a little bit too much cannon fire and had seen too many men bayoneted and shot to death. And again, think of if they were in fact had been in the battle 4 months previously. Imagine what it would have been like to be in a land battle with rudimentary weapons in a situation in which 50,000 of your troops and of the enemy forces were either killed or injured. It must have been an incredible trauma for them to be in the Battle of Gettysburg, which was also contested for 3 days of land battle, which must have been just an incredibly grinding battle to have survived. So I was then really disturbed. My training had told me that whenever you get more than 2 episodes of surveillance, of being conspicuous, just engage at least at some kind of evasion strategy, at least to pull yourself away from clusters of other people. In other words, if you're in the downtown area, go up an alley. If you find yourself in a battle, go to the side of the battle. If you find yourself in a campground, just go out in the woods. Because we were always taught to imitate. I think as an accomplished anthropologist, Sasha, I think you'll appreciate this. We were kind of told in kind of that Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson way that if they sent you, let's say, to a group of indigenous people in South America that are rubbing ceremonial paint on their faces, sit there and rub the ceremonial paint on your face in the same way. In other words, always be a joiner of the social group that you find yourself in, and a complier, a participant. So I was really just sort of spooked that 3 different groups of people, including my own father, had kind of reacted to me in a conspicuous way. So what I did is, and I was also concerned about my shoes being so conspicuous. So I walked about 100 paces from the dais, and knowing that Abraham Lincoln, as my father had said when he showed me the mimeograph back on the drafting table back at the lab in East Hanover, I knew that Lincoln would soon be arriving on the right side of the dais as we were looking at it. So that would have been, that would have been the western side of the dais. So I walked this 100 paces north with my back, and standing with my back to the dais, I looked east, putting my right foot east and my left foot north, so that anybody who looked over at me would not notice these huge shoes I was in, or this mismatch of clothing I was in. And as I assumed that posture, I saw a man that had to have been Matthew Brady because of his physiognomy. It was Matthew Brady. I saw his pince-nez glasses, his distinctive Van Dyke beard, and I researched that Matthew Brady was then about 39 years old in 1863, and he was setting up his camera on a small stepladder. And I then looked to the right again, and as I was fading from view, I looked over quickly and then back again because I saw that he had actually taken the photograph as I was fading from view. Now, what we know is that my face is blurry in that image, which is the so-called Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg, which was donated to the Library of Congress in 1951 in a cache of photographs that had belonged to Matthew Brady. And in Brady's handwriting on that original negative, or actually copy of the photo, the package that the negative was in, it said, "Citizens of Gettysburg gathering to see President Lincoln give a speech, November 19th, 1863. So I believe that Brady was the photographer. So that kind of takes us up to what happened as I originally experienced it and what resulted. But then when I both researched who the man was who helped me with giving me the jacket and the shoes, and then I went to Gettysburg, I have basically now proven that I went to Gettysburg, and that's what I've been so eager to talk about, on the air since October of last year.
Wow.
Almost a year. That my trip in October of 2013, literally the sesquicentennial of the Gettysburg Address and Gettysburg Battle, proved that everything I claimed about my experiences there is verifiable. And I guess I'd like to start with the initial exploration I did of the facts, because it'll show that beyond any chance, the facts I've been stating are true, and I did actually go there via plasma confinement.
Can I ask a question first? Because since you're a known whistleblower, and this is a clandestine operation, how come they let you go recently?
Well, I I haven't been interfered with since 2003, when I was advised by the Bush administration that if I continue to investigate